Cool. So I was asked if I wanted to talk about stimulus and some of that stuff, and happy to. I didn't prepare any slides because stimulus is kind of in a weird spot, and I think it's a little bit more interesting to talk a little bit about the context around what's happening with the project and with Rails and with Basecamp and their kind of new style of development, and so we can talk about that a little bit, and we can walk through. I don't know, have any of you used Stimulus? I know David Baldwin, I think you've dabbled or are familiar.
Yep,
other guys?
I've used it.
Chris or other Dave?
I have not.
I played with it a little bit by spinning up a new Rails app and just seeing what I can attach. But that was long ago when it was brand new too, so I don't know. Not really.
Yeah. Cool.
I'm familiar with the concept.
I have maybe 8 to 10 controllers in one production app that may or may not stay there based upon if I move things to live view or move a few other things over to Alpine.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Up on the screen, spoilers. Okay, cool. I'll go over kind of everything I was planning to then, and we'll just fast forward if it gets boring. So I've been following this kind of stack for a while now. This stack being this kind of out-of-the-box vanilla Rails stack, and then following sort of the Basecamp style of doing things. So it's plain Rails, but then actually sort of going all in on turbolinks and stimulus, which is sort of the kind of missing piece of the puzzle. I think if anybody was around when turbolinks came out in 2014-ish, there's kind of a problem with the rollout, and that this was still sort of the jQuery days, and pretty much everything that was a jQuery plugin didn't really work with turbolinks, and a lot of that was due to just the way that turbolinks works, where it's sort of swapping out the body of the page, and the big issue was sort of that jQuery kind of ran top to bottom on the page, and so if you were binding event handlers and stuff, it kind of expected it to be there, and then it didn't. And there's some weird things you could do with there's sort of the live keyword in jQuery or function or whatever, where it would sort of be constantly monitoring for new elements getting added and binding up the events. But really, that was kind of the problem when turbolinks came out, is that a lot of the existing tools people were using broke, so people just immediately sort of turned it off. And it wasn't really until kind of everything moved away from jQuery into React, sort of Reactive View and some of these other tools, that turbolinks kind of is having a little bit of a heyday, as less people are using jQuery, or the jQuery plugins have been made a little bit more robust. So there's kind of this weird dynamic where lots of people tried this thing at first, they stopped using it, or developed a bad opinion of it. And, the people that stuck around, or maybe that weren't in the first wave of this, are now oh yeah, this is good, and we've not had any problems. So stimulus is kind of the last little piece of glue here, and so the idea with stimulus is that it's built based on Mutation Observer, which is this JavaScript API that lets you sort of respond reactively to DOM mutation. So that was kind of the key insight that Sam Stevenson and Javin at Basecamp had when they were sort of trying to fill in this missing piece of the turbolink story. So when turbolinks swaps out the body of the document, the mutation events still fire, and so that's if you kind of build that as the base of your framework instead of kind of the older school jQuery way where you were running the script tag in line at the bottom of your page. You kind of avoid a bunch of the like lifecycle issues that they had with jQuery. So I think recently there's been a lot more interest in this. I tweeted this out in April when Basecamp was getting ready to release their Hey email client. DHH had started this practice in one of the, I think in Basecamp 3, but they basically ship the full source maps that are unminified and not like mangled for their apps. And so I was looking at source maps, and it was really surprising to see that they're building this like fully featured SPA type, basically sort of like Gmail app, and this was the only JavaScript that they were using. So in the source maps, you can find the modules folder, which generally has got thousands and thousands of folders, and they had TurboLinks. They had this local time thing, which is a neat little library that they have for wrapping timestamps. So like your created at and updated at, it wraps them in an element that can do the like local like time, like 3 hours ago, 2 hours ago, but it also generates like time tags and stuff. So nothing too interesting there. There's like a polyfill for this submitting a form via JavaScript, and then there's this hotkey library from GitHub for doing key bindings, and then Stimulus. And so that's it. That's all the like JavaScript dependencies. So there's no React or Vue or any of that stuff, but even still, it's pretty minimal. And so I think a lot of people are like, oh, this is interesting. And then Sam, who is the guy behind a lot of the framework stuff that comes out of Basecamp, he had this Twitter thread recently when they sort of launched Hey, and just talking about kind of the approach of it's 100% HTML over the wire. It's just no JSON APIs, just form submissions links. They talk about how they're using TurboLinks, and then some of the new stuff that's going to be coming out, soon, TM. There's better handling for forms with TurboLinks. They're doing this interesting thing that I'm still not entirely sure I'll ever need, but they basically have this thing called like TurboLinks frame, which is sort of like an iframe that is its own like browser context that has its own like TurboLinks type thing where stuff gets swapped in and out of that. There's also some other stuff around partial page updates. That's kind of interesting. They are still using Stimulus for app-specific JavaScript. Kind of, I don't mean to like throw a wet blanket on everything, but it sounds like they're actually moving away less and less from using Stimulus. But we'll see. It's kind of hard to get a true sense of what's out there since they're still in the part of the cycle where they're extracting from their code base, the patterns and tools and stuff. So where we're at with Stimulus. Stimulus, the current version, last release was in January of 2019. So you may see this and say like, okay, cool, that's fine. If you're coming from like a JavaScript heavy React world, that's probably somewhat surprising that it's been 18 months since there was a release. Part of that is like that Stimulus is a pretty small library, and so you could just say like, well, it's just done. But there's this other wrinkle, and a lot of this is, I don't know how interesting. Like, let me know if you guys care at all about the like inside baseball of what is happening, with Basecamp and some of this stuff. But in November of 2018, this pull request has been opened, which is basically sort of changing the entire API of the library. And this was originally going to be like a 1.0, and now it's the 2.0. So it's been, 2.5 years that this has been sitting out here, like waiting to get merged, and people have weighed in, and it's kind of it's in a weird state. They basically are saying like, oh yeah, here's this like latest development build that's just like some random like shod zip file of the source code, and this is what they're running in production on A, and this is what like the if you want to run the latest, like what I've been calling like the 2.0 release candidate, it's like this is it here, just this kind of not very well publicized thing. So it's kind of in a weird spot, and it sort of remains to be seen how all the pieces will come together.
I guess if nothing else, at least you can feel fairly confident if that's what they're using on Hay, that it's going to be in there, right?
Yeah. I think like the kind of community of people that are using Stimulus a lot, like are like comfortable pointing to this and saying like, yep, we're going to run against this build. So it's just kind of a weird quirk, right? It's like if this was any. Sometimes I think if it was anybody other than Basecamp, I'd be like, yeah, this is like an abandoned project that like no one should be using, or like what the heck, or why don't you publish some official packages? The nice part about Stimulus, when you look at it in the ecosystem, so the other tool that's very similar is Alpine, and both of these tools are this kind of approach where you're putting your JavaScript behavior partially in your markdown, or your markup, excuse me. So you can see here in Stimulus, you're sort of using data target to bind things. You're using data action to like set up event handlers and action things, and same kind of thing in Alpine. Alpine has these like X data, X show. Alpine, you can do more things just in the markup. Like you can set variable values and run little snippets of JavaScript. Whereas Stimulus, you kind of annotate your markup and then you write a controller behind it that actually runs the code. So, hello, Joel. Good to see you. This is kind of like the place to go for the Stimulus stuff if you're interested. There's really kind of two documents. There's the handbook, which sort of talks a little bit about the philosophy of the library and how you might use it, and kind of walking you through. And then there's just like the reference guide, which is just the API docs. And then there's a forum that I'd say is not super active. There's been some people in here, and the Basecamp guys are in here talking sometimes. And then the actual project on GitHub, which, as you can tell, or as you may guess from the fact that this 2.0 release has been sitting here for 2.5 years, is not terribly active. Not a lot going on in the repository. So I don't know, what would you all like to see or talk about? I've written a couple different articles about how you might use this, some sort of like intermediate steps about it. If you want to see some controllers that I have in the Sandbox app, what sounds good?
Any of that sounds fine to me. I do, and we've chatted about this a little bit, but I'm sort of in Elixir land with LiveView now, and so it's hard for me not to look back on Rails and things being used over there, and how they might apply to Rails. And it seems like there's some stuff happening in terms of Stimulus and in making AJAX calls, and making that a pretty easy process. Are you doing some of that stuff?
Yeah. So, and this is I can show what I would say is currently the kind of norms of using Stimulus for that kind of stuff. It's really tricky, and it's kind of in a, not necessarily precarious, but it's just in an unknown state because it's sort of yet to be seen what Basecamp is going to come out with and say is sort of the blessed way of doing some of this stuff. Maybe it'd be interesting to look at the source maps for a second here, if you're curious, David, about some of the like Phoenix Live View-ish stuff that seems like it's coming down the pipe. So I just made a trial account here on Hey. I'm not actually a customer, but yeah, the nice part, like I said, is all the source maps are there, so you can just pull it up and open this little Webpack thing and look into the JavaScript and see. So you can see here, I wasn't lying about the node modules. Looks like they added a couple more things, action cable, and scroll anchor thing. But so there's your packages, and then in here is sort of the application specific code. One of the interesting things is that's basically the Phoenix Live View-ish thing that seems like it's coming is this thing that it's called Page Updater. And I don't know, I think there's probably some marketing names for this stuff, but nobody wants to tell me what it is. The idea with that is, let's see, what's the best way to jump into this? Well, the idea is that, you know how in the old school way of Rails stuff there was that, signal versus noise, server, JavaScript, This was like the, 2013, 2014 way of doing things with the JS, ERB, partials, this kind of stuff. So that was sort of the old school answer for how to do interactive apps with Rails. You would use the remote form stuff and the remote links and use the Rails UJS thing, and then have your controller render back these kind of, this is not even, yeah, this is right. Do these JavaScript responses where you're like building up this JavaScript that dynamically executes, and I think for the most part, like, nobody really likes this, right? I don't know.
I did a lot of that.
I've done a lot of that too.
So this has some problems in that, like, it's just kind of funky. You're like 4 levels in of, like, it's Ruby code that's like inside of an ERB thing generating HTML, but it's actually generating JavaScript commands, and you have escaping and partial rendering and all that stuff. And then there's the other issue where just like sending down arbitrary JavaScript that you execute on your page is kind of a security. I don't know if I'd say it's a worse practice, but it's certainly can be an issue. And so things like the content security policy kind of doesn't work when you're just sending back random chunks of JavaScript to execute on your page. And we had the whole adventure with CoffeeScript and some of that stuff. So this style kind of went out of fashion, but it's really kind of still the only way to do the partial page updates until this new thing that came out. So if you look through the Basecamp source code, you see like 90% of the path here. This is probably too small. Is that a little bit easier to see?
Yes.
And feel free to pull up a browser and follow along if you want. If you just go to the sign-in screen for Hey, you don't even have to log in. You can just go to the sign-up page, and all the source maps are there too. But the idea basically is that they send up a request with, let's see if I can find it. There's page update. So they send up a request, and if they get back on the server, they handle it with this special MIME type that is text HTML page update. The idea is that instead of doing the server JavaScript response where you just send back the raw JavaScript to execute, you basically send back a response with this bind type, and then the front end code knows how to handle that, so they kind of hook into the fetch or Ajax stuff that they're doing. The idea is that those responses will have a template tag, like an HTML template tag, and then that template tag will have attributes on it that fit into these commands. So there's like append, prepend, replace, update, move, and then the inside of the template tag is HTML, like the snippet or whatever that is this content. So in this, like in this example of the old school way of doing it, instead of saying, okay, on the messages div prepend this rendered thing, you would return back a response with that special MIME type that was a template tag that has like target messages command equals prepend, and then inside of that tag is this rendered HTML. So it's an interesting, like, what is old is new again, in the sense that it's not doing like any kind of DOM diffing or hot swapping of things like in some of the other front end situations. But they basically said these are the kind of commands that people are doing in these server JavaScript responses anyways, and if we structure them like this so that you're not actually executing arbitrary JavaScript, you're just picking which command to apply the content to, then you can still get the CSP content security protection stuff. So we don't really know what the back end of this is going to look like. I think we can guess that there's going to be some kind of Rails controller helpers to help you render things in that format. But if nothing else, I mean, you could probably glue together something similar. So the idea here is that if you're on a page and this isn't exactly how this works, but just as an example, like you click this thing and it loads back this content, you'd be making a request and you get back a template tag that has this this menu list inside of it with the append, and it gets appended into the markup on the page. So that's how you can sort of do like a partial page refresh. The other thing that makes it kind of like Phoenix Live View is that there are hooks in here for action cable. So you can send it back in an action cable like channel broadcast, and the same stuff gets applied with that page updater. So that's, and I was a little bit surprised because I thought that was kind of like the big reveal that was coming, and they've at least Sam Stevenson has kind of been, I don't know, to me like not necessarily talking about that aspect of it. The thing that they have been talking more about is the it's like TurboLinks frame thing. So you can see in the markup here, there's all these little like TurboLinks frames, and I haven't dug too much into the source of this because it was kind of hard to follow, especially before Hey was out and you could sign up because you couldn't even really see what the page was doing. But you can basically think of these as like iframes, which is also just kind of funky. Like a lot of the stuff that Basecamp seems to be doing is like very old school way of doing things. But imagine like an iframe without all the problems of the iframe, and that's kind of the concept. So this, you would give it a source, and so it would load this request, this endpoint, into this frame, and then any kind of clicking or form submission stuff that you do inside of this frame is all kind of scoped within that context. So if you click a link, and that's how this menu thing actually works, is that this is like a frame. So you imagine that this is like an iframe, and I go here, Looks like that got ejected. Maybe there's some of these, or maybe this is a bad example. If you can imagine, like some of these would, if you click this, it would swap out this menu with, more details if you're going down, stuff like that. It's kind of interesting on the page here. These like persistent buttons and stuff. This is also like a frame. So as you switch between pages, if you have this thing on here, let's see, what would be a good example. Sorry, I didn't plan this out very well. But the idea would be if you go to like your next message, like that's happening on a frame that's in sort of the background, and then this frame is the same. So a little bit funky. I haven't fully wrapped my head around the frame stuff too much. But that said, there are still a bunch of stimulus controllers, and I think kind of how it will shake up is that the page updater stuff and the TurboLinks frame stuff is kind of like the frameworky type stuff that you can use to you use these as like common patterns. And then if you have application specific JavaScript little sprinkles of behavior that you want, that's when you would use Stimulus for Stimulus. So it's kind of interesting. You can look through their controllers folder here and see some of the controllers. And
do you think the page updater thing is working in tandem with the TurboLinks frame thing, or do you think it's for a separate use case?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked in depth enough. The TurboLinks frame thing is its own like web element, which is like a web. Is it web component? I can never remember what the name of the thing is, but it's got a bunch of code in there. So I'm not sure. I think you should still be able to just, like, if you imagine making like, remote links or remote form submissions, I think it's going to be most useful for forms. So right now, if you're using TurboLinks and you submit forms, there's kind of no answer for what's supposed to happen if there's like a validation error, at least built into the framework. So if you can do these partial page updates, you can say, oh, okay, if there's an error, like re-render the form and just replace the form instead of replacing the whole page. So I think that was at least my sort of thought on what we would be getting. This frame thing is kind of was a sort of a surprise to me. So we'll see. We'll see what it shakes out. So maybe I can just walk through a couple of the controllers that I have been using, just to sort of show sort of what kinds of things I've been using this for. I think this checkbox one is actually a pretty good example. This is just like a sandbox app I have, and all this stuff too is mostly covered in these articles on Boring Rails if you want to look at it in more detail later. But so kind of imagine like you have this email preferences thing, and you just want these like check all and check none boxes. Well, in the good old days, this would just be a little blob of jQuery. You bind to this and say on click, query all checkboxes and call the .check method on them. So certainly, if you're familiar with that kind of pattern of sort of progressive enhancement of JavaScript on the page, I think Stimulus is sort of right up your alley. The real benefits are that the event listener stuff is sort of all handled for you by the framework by annotating your HTML, and everything works nicely with TurboLinks. And then the controllers that you write are, should be probably more agreeable to most people's style of writing code than some of the jQuery spaghetti of the old days. And you can use all of the same ES6 stuff that all the other tools are using. So let me just show you this this controller. So yeah, if you see here, there's kind of two pieces to all these stimulus things. There's your markup, which sort of sets up the controller, and then the code that runs behind it. It's kind of nice in some ways. It's at least heavily emphasizes the benefit of Stimulus that you can read through the HTML templates and sort of guess what is going to happen without actually looking at the JavaScript. Drop in here. So this is the email preferences that maps to this section of the page here, and you basically create a controller by just setting this data controller attribute. Checkbox list here maps via Ruby and Rails naming convention magic to checkbox underscore list underscore controller. So the way it works is when Stimulus registers its mutation listeners. So when it sees a mutation, it sort of crawls the DOM and then looks for these data controller attributes and then does its thing. So there's a connect method, which is it's like the lifecycle event that gets called when the component gets connected into the page. So there's a connect and a disconnect. And then there's also an initializer if you want just a constructor type thing. So then the other aspects of Stimulus are the actions. So if you see down here, we have these buttons for check all and check none, and you just set data action attributes. And by default, there's a default event. So for a button, it's the click event. For if you had a drop down, it would be the change event. If it was a text input, it's the change event. If it's a link or button, it's click. So you don't need to necessarily type that in. But you can think of this as sort of, if you go back to the old jQuery days, it would be like whatever this button is, and then you'd say on click run this function. So whatever would go here, you can sort of bind automatically in Stimulus, and then you just pass it the controller that it should call, and then the method. So in this case, if you click this check all button, we are firing the check all method on the checkbox list controller. So that goes here and calls this and runs this little bit of code. So you can see you can use all the fancy splat operators and inline functions and ES6 string interpolation and all that good stuff. So a little bit nicer and gives you some conventions around writing. Gives you the folders to put stuff in and the things, the naming conventions and whatnot. Any questions on this controller or me? So I think this is probably where most people will find themselves starting with Stimulus is just making these small little things where you want someone to slide over or hide. I think probably everyone that uses Stimulus writes some version of a controller that is like a toggle controller that's like, when this thing happens, toggle some classes on this thing on or off. So you can use that to make little little pop-ups or little accordion type things. I have a controller in one of my apps that I can put on to text. If it is a really long block of text, it just you can put a little show more and then put a little controller on that. So if you click that, then it swaps out, hides the abbreviated div and shows the one that's got the full text. So there's stuff like that. And then I think kind of the next level that you start to see happening is kind of making these like composable controllers that you can kind of glue together. So this example that I made here is, aside from the tennis shoes part, is code that I have in my production work app for filtering. So let's see what will be just interesting part here. So I have a filters controller, and the idea of the filters controller is that when I change these inputs, it runs this controller code that binds to the different targets and pulls out the input values, and then you can shove that onto the URL in the params hash, and then you can do a very, very Railsy like filter page by pulling out the params here. So the idea here is that I didn't necessarily write a sneaker filter controller or make a React component that has these inputs in it, but rather I just made a filter controller that is responsible for taking inputs and tacking them onto the query parameters here. And then you can see in the markup, we have a data controller filters, and then you just can use the action to trigger the filter method, and then you can use this target thing, which does the sort of data binding. So this data binds into this filter targets. So anything that has a target of filter gets automatically data bound, and it's just one way data binding. So the nice part about this is, I can add extra filters to this, and I don't need to change the JavaScript at all. So I would just, if I wanted to add, some other attribute, you can just copy paste and add a new form element for however we wanted to sort and filter it, wire up the actions and the targets, and then this JavaScript stuff doesn't change at all. And you can see that you can also combine. You can have sort of nested controllers. So inside of that filters controller, I have this section, which is for this color filter. So I'm using that same checkbox list controller here, except I am just using the select none, but I just called it clear filter, but it's still running the same check none code here. And so you can nest these things together. When I click this, it's toggling on and off like a hidden class on this this pop-up here. So this is, let's see, right here, this hide controller. This is probably one of the most basic controllers that I think everyone has a version of in their app that's using Stimulus. So a hide controller that takes a toggle and goes to the thing that you've data bound and toggles a hidden class to show or hide it. So in this page here, we're sort of composing together these three controllers. So there's the filters controller that grabs all of the inputs and puts it in there. There's the checkbox list for this bit here, and then there's the hiding to kind of show and hide this. So that's kind of one way to think about some of the stimulus stuff. If you are familiar at all with concerns in Rails and the sort of idea of it's kind of the aspect-oriented programming model of building behaviors instead of features, or kind of an object-oriented way of thinking about it. I think that is a pretty useful frame of mind to be in when you're writing stimulus controllers. So that tends to lead you down the path of making them fairly generic. So I have a whole article about that here, about the tips for how to compose them, and it's using the same example. So if you want more in depth or want to be able to look at the code, it's all up in the blog post. The other kind of neat thing with stimulus, and I talked about this in this other article I wrote about doing the hover cards, is sort of combining stimulus with the HTML over-the-wire pattern, which is basically, instead of returning JSON from endpoints, returning HTML and then swapping in and out. So like we talked about with that page updater stuff, I think that's definitely something that's not going away in Rails and will probably be brought more to the forefront. But even without the partial page update stuff, you can still do things like these hover cards. So if I go here, so you've probably seen these on GitHub or Twitter. It's a pretty common web pattern now, but like you hover over something and it shows this pop-up, right? So you can implement this, and I think a pretty clean way with stimulus by when you hover over, you can bind the hover action. And you hover over, making an AJAX call to then get the HTML that is this pop-up, and then you just insert that into the page. And when you go away, you can hide it or remove it, whatever you want to do. And so you can see here, if I refresh and then open the network tab, we just inspect this. You can see, like, so this user, this @Swanson thing, it's got a data controller hover card. It's got a URL value, which is user/ID/hover card. And then the action, in this case, we use mouse enter. So on mouse enter, we're going to show, and on mouse leave, we're going to hide. And that calls this code, you can see on the left here, the show and the hide. So if you look at the network tab, and I actually hover over, makes a request to that URL, and then what it actually gets back is this blob of HTML. And so then in the JavaScript, we just using fetch that, grab the HTML. So normally, if you're doing like a JSON thing, you call like the JSON parse stuff there. But here it's just HTML, and then we just append that into the page. So I think it's pretty neat. And then if you imagine on the back end, you could start thinking about like, okay, if we have a lot of these hover cards and we use them on different entities, how do we, is there like a concern that we can make that's like, hover cardable or something, and start thinking about sharing the templates for that, or are there some ways to use like polymorphic associations or things like that in the back end. So it's kind of a neat path if you are into the like concern style composing of behaviors style of programming. So I'd say those are kind of the two patterns. It's like if you had something that used to be like a jQuery, like on click, run this little bit of code, that's probably pretty easy to move to stimulus. Benefits being that you can write it in nice, ES6 class files, and it will work really well if you're in a Rails TurboLinks environment, because all this stuff plays nicely together. So that's kind of one thing. And then if you you could obviously just use it for that if you want, or if you want to go further down the composable behavior stuff on the back end, maybe there's opportunities for using some of this HTML over the wire stuff with Stimulus, maybe with some of the new page updater stuff. If and when that sees the light, that's probably going to be interesting in Rails 6.1. I think you can maybe I'll just highlight that, like, this bit of code here, like this fetching and then parsing this back and appending it. I don't think this is probably long term what would be recommended with Stimulus. I think they would say, like, oh yeah, we can use the remote page updater stuff to do that. So you could make an AJAX call to that hover card thing and then have that return that template response that I talked about earlier that would have this markup in it. But imagine, let me just paste it into code here. It's easier to show. So you can imagine this is the content, but then it's wrapped in a template tag here. And I don't remember the exact, but let's say that this is whatever. This is the ID that you target, and there's data command. And so instead of having maybe one-off controllers that are make a request to this, get a HTML response, and then append this. Maybe with the page updater stuff, you would just do something like this, and have your server side controller return this template response, and it would do basically the same thing.
I think I prefer the fetch in the JavaScript.
Yeah.
Just so that when you're working on the front end and in the view and in the JavaScript, you know directly where the thing's going. Whereas this one, I don't know. I've been working in an environment where we've got front end stuff and back end stuff fairly decoupled in a lot of ways. And so my brain's still working and be well, front end developers are going to be in this stuff and back end developers are going to be over here, and getting it so that they can work at different speeds is helpful sometimes. And in this case, whoever's writing the template on the back end, in the straight, we're just going to render an HTML fragment that the front end can do whatever they want with. Whoever's writing the controller doesn't need to know or care necessarily what the markup it's getting inserted into looks like. Because then the front end can use the same endpoint that you only have to write the Rails controller once. And then you could use it in many different JavaScript contexts where you might be updating a different data target or doing something different with the same HTML chunk you got out of there.
Yeah, and there is something that I can't quite put my finger on that it does feel a little bit gross to be doing some of this. And
oh yeah.
it feels like there's a lot of implicit knowledge about where it will be used that you sort of lose. And even in this case, so yeah, we could replace this little bit with something like that page updater stuff, but well, we wouldn't be able to do the extra little bit of functionality. I have it here basically caching the card so that if you go back, hover over it again, it's just showing and hiding it instead of refetching it every time. So stuff like that I think would be hard to do with just the the little partial fragment updating. But on the other hand, for submitting a form and you just want this to get replaced, or you've got a modal form and you want to close the modal and then render the new list item at the bottom of the list, I think this is probably going to be the way to go. So I think there's still going to be some room for writing Stimulus controllers and the like. The other thing I have used Stimulus with fetch for is, and there's actually an example of it in the Stimulus handbook itself, is this kind of lazy loading content loader. So that's kind of like if you go to GitHub, you can see an example of a very slow version of this. I don't know why it's so slow, but this like activity thing that's loading. So if you follow through the handbook, they basically show you how to build a generic content loader in Stimulus that just takes the URL that you want to load, and then you could it's pretty similar to this bit here. So I think it's kind of in a weird state where there's some like components and sort of like really reusable generic front end things that you could build with this, and then there's obviously like super specific application stuff. Like if you have a form that you want to have a little bit of dynamic behavior and things show and hide, and when you enable this thing, it disables these elements and things like that. I think you're still going to have to reach for a stimulus controller. So I don't know. It's really an interesting stack to follow, but it's kind of in a precarious spot because it's sort of all changing, and you get caught in this sort of double-edged sword where you're kind of I'm really like appreciative of what Basecamp is doing and open sourcing a lot of this stuff, but you also have to sort of wait for them to actually release some of the stuff, and there's not a lot of visibility into that. So like we talked about earlier, like there's been for 2.5 years they've been sitting on releasing the 2.0 API of Stimulus. I don't think it's going to change drastically, but they just have, for better or worse, like they're working on their products, and it's not their top priority. And in some ways, I actually really value that about Basecamp and Rails, and just the idea that stuff is actually extracted out of production systems. I think is a huge benefit, but it does come with the downside of you have to actually write the production stuff to then be able to extract it and then make the time for that. So I think it's in a fine state. I mean, I'm using this. I wouldn't really say you need to be too cautious about like using the library. Just know that if you're hoping for the complete anecdote to the ever-changing like JavaScript, React, Vue, front-end stuff, things are not quite settled here either.
I have a question about your fetch stuff there. Were you trying to cache because you didn't want to hit your server, or because you wanted to keep client fast? Like, what was the reasoning there?
Yeah, it was just to avoid like if you go like this, that we're making network requests every 2 seconds.
Yeah, I'm just wondering.
So I think both, right? It would reduce the the number of requests and also keep it faster, since we're not paying the latency of an AJAX call every time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just curious if maybe the newer features are doing something with server response caching in a way that is different from what you might get here.
Yeah.
It's a templating system, this big deep enough into Rails, maybe just like 3 or 4 that thing.
Yeah, that could be. That's really the biggest unknown piece, is like the Rails stuff, because we can dig around in the source maps, but they're using they have I think David posted the gem file for Hey, which was like, it was cool, but also just like
it's a lot.
Like they're using this gem called Okra. Like, what is that? I want to know what it is. And it's just like, oh yeah, it's just a private gem in the Basecamp thing. And they're like, oh yeah, eventually it will be released. There's this turbo gem is where all the new turbo links stuff, and I imagine that the template page updater stuff is going to be, but like no one can see it quite yet. So
Yeah, I mean, like, what if Okra actually is like 15 different gems, but they're putting it all under that code name?
yeah, I don't know.
It's actually a gumbo reference.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about this one. Like, I feel like it has to do with action text because it's up in this little action text section, and I don't know. I'm both excited, but also like somewhat annoyed at a lot of this stuff that's happening because it's hard to want to like advocate for using these tools in work and even like writing articles and stuff when you don't really know what's going to happen, and you're just going to get a dump sometime when they're like, all right, here's the new way that Turbolinks is going to work. Or, I tried to submit a pull request about a year ago to Action Text to fix a bug, and they're like, oh yeah, we're rewriting all the internals of Action Text, so let's just wait on this. It's like, oh, okay, cool. I guess I'll just monkey patch this and wait. So I don't know. This is just kind of an interesting, even if you don't care about the stimulus stuff, just looking at the gems. I always like seeing what is being used or is not being used. There's I think it's in here. Yeah, this is kind of a cool project that I think they're working on called Console 1984. That's supervised Rails console. So like if you Rails console into production, it makes you like answer this prompt that's like, what are you accessing and why? So you have like a log of who's been accessing customer data and stuff, which I think is important for some of the like GDPR and privacy things. So that'll be kind of neat when that comes out.
Well, if nothing else, I feel like Stimulus is pretty easy to understand. I mean, at least, I'm using it. I didn't even realize there was a 2.0 that was supposed to be coming. So,
yeah, surprise.
I haven't written that much in it, so I'm not worried about it. But at least version 1, it was like, what can you do with Stimulus? And then 30 minutes later, you've basically gone through all the docs.
Yeah.
So I like that part of it. But then it comes down to what are the business requirements, and at some point you may end up having to write a lot of JavaScript, and if you put that in Stimulus and then the API changes a whole bunch, as you say, it's a little bit of a precarious predicament to be in, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's mostly good things that are getting added. I mean, the biggest changes are that they're adding this like values API where you can give a type to like your values that you pass in, which before you everything was kind of like a string. So if you were trying to pass a number in or something, you had to like cast it yourself or a true false value. So that'll be nice. They're doing these like value changed callbacks, which seems really nice, but I haven't actually had the need to do it. So like if you mutate the markup, you can get these like callbacks that trigger. So a little bit going down the kind of like reactive, rabbit hole there. And then, just kind of like unifying target things. So it shouldn't be too bad to upgrade whenever it comes out. If I had to guess, I'd say that this is probably the closest of a lot of the stuff I showed today that is not released to being released, right? This pull request has been sitting there. They've been using it for a while, so it's probably just once they decide that it's time to start open sourcing all the things, this is probably one of the first dominoes to fall is the Stimulus 2.0 release. That's all I've got. Like I said, I got these articles on boring Rails. If you want to read more, look at the code. All the stuff I talked about today is in these most recent 2 articles here. Stimulus, the best Stimulus resource, I think, is just the official site. There's a couple things that I link at the bottom of one of the articles here. If you want to know more, there's this site that's kind of interesting, Better Stimulus, that just talks about some sort of best practices. I think that this is modeled after there's like a better RSpec or something like that site that is the same format. A lot of it is, like good, bad, do this, not this. This is kind of an interesting project someone is making called Stimulus Use, which is kind of like React hooks, but for stimulus. So give that a check out. Maybe only interesting to someone like David that's already got stimulus in their project. I probably wouldn't start there. Yeah. That's all I got. Anyone have any other questions or want to chat about other stuff? Stimulus, TurboLinks, boring Rails, Basecamp.
Well, maybe just related to this, what are other people using? I'm personally trying to get rid of any remnants of any JavaScript in my projects at this point. I don't like writing JavaScript, but there are places where it's necessary. But what are other people? Chris, are you guys? Are you using Vue or React or
Work is React. Well, the legacy app has more spaghetti jQuery written by Rails programmers, 5 years ago. So all the new stuff though is single page application React stuff. And we went that path in a lot of reasons, mostly to get speed at the time, because we can have folks who are devoted to we're building out the front end, and then I can also have folks devoted to we're building out APIs to be able to power those, and those two things can move at different speeds. When I build stuff on my own, this is really appealing because much like David, I don't want to be writing JavaScript anymore than I have to. And if I'm going to do it, I want to make it simple and fairly easy to understand because I'm coming in and out of it over time. That and a lot of this is more than a little familiar to how I built a lot of stuff 10 years ago at this point. With that sort of send HTML over the wire, and then you'd have a little tiny bit of JavaScript that basically makes the request, gets the thing, sticks it in the DOM. And there's some elements of that are really familiar inside a lot of this, which is appealing, especially because making the request is a lot easier now than it was back then.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to, with this stack, it sort of does, it does work better in an environment where it's a smaller team or a single group of people, and I think that's definitely where context comes in a lot in a lot of these framework things. So yeah, for sure, if you've got 20 engineers and you need to divide and conquer on stuff, definitely this is probably going to be worse in a lot of ways. If you're hey, we've got 3 people and we have to do it all, and no one can keep track of all the front end and all the back end stuff. I think it's certainly a lot more appealing. That's definitely the kind of context that I'm working in myself at the moment. Is the second one. Well, thanks for chatting. I'm gonna head off.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
No problem.
Well, have a wonderful night. Thanks for presenting, Matt.
Yep. Talk to you later.
See you.
Good night.